Hello students, welcome to Political Science class. Myself Mrs. Swati Hazare from Gokhale Education Society's HL High School, English Medium, Ozhar, Nasik. Today we are going to learn Political Science of Standard 9th from Maharashtra State Board English Medium syllabus. Chapter number 6, International Problems. International problems. Till the last chapter, we studied the sovereign states in the international system, India's foreign policy, and India's defense system. We also studied the objectives of the United Nations. In this chapter, we are going to study some important international problems. Some problems are not restricted to any one country. They affect many countries and eventually all the countries of the world. These problems that affect the whole world are called international problems. These problems that affect the whole world are called international problems. In order to solve these international problems, all nations needs to make joint efforts. In order to solve these international problems, all nations need to make joint efforts. In this chapter, we shall therefore study problems related to human rights, environment, and tourism. Even the questions of refugees are now assuming global proportions. Hence, we shall consider this issue as well. Human rights. The concept of human rights has emerged from the concept of natural rights. Natural rights are those rights that we are endowed with because we are born as human beings. So, human rights are those rights that are necessary for living as a human being and as a constituent of society. Human rights include the right to life, food, clothing, shelter, education, and health. The human rights were first proclaimed during the American War of Independence and the French Revolution in 1989. The realization that democratic government is necessary for upholding human rights led to the adoption of democracy by many European countries. The main responsibility of the state came to be understood to be the protection of citizens' rights. Currently, Justice K.G. Balkrishnan is the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. The American and the French revolutions proclaimed liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice as human rights. The idea that in order to realize these rights, a democratic form of government is essential was strengthened. After that, several European nations adopted democratic constitutions and governments. This brought limits on the authority of the state. The main responsibility of the state came to be understood to be the protection of citizens' rights. Rise of the concept of human rights in international relations. Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the United Nations General Assembly by a majority vote of on 10th December 1948. Declaration of the Rights of the Child was proclaimed on 20th November 1959. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights were adopted in 1966. The above two covenants are a part of international law and all member nations are bound to observe them. The issues related to the violation of human rights, such as social segregation in South Africa and freedom to colonies, were raised in the General Assembly. The concept of human rights was broadened by issues of global nature like contagious diseases, the threat to the environment, terrorism and natural disasters. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a milestone document in the history of human rights, drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world. The declaration was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on 10th December 1948 as a common standard of achievements for all people and all nations. It sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected, and it has been translated into over 500 languages. International human rights law lays down the obligations of governments to act in certain ways or to refrain from certain acts in order to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals or groups. One of the great achievements of the United Nations is the creation of a comprehensive body of human rights law, a universal and internationally protected code to which all nations can subscribe and all people aspire. The United Nations has defined a broad range of internationally accepted rights, including civil, cultural, economic, political and social rights. It has also established mechanisms to promote and protect these rights and to assist states in carrying out their responsibilities. Come to the next point, human rights and India. The human rights find a place as the fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution. The responsibility of the protection of the weaker sections, women and minorities has been given to the government. Human Rights Protection Act was enacted in 1993. As per this law, National Human Rights Commission and the State Human Rights Commission were established. Human Rights in India. The NHRC is the National Human Rights Commission of India, responsible for the protection and promotion of human rights, defined by the Act as rights relating to life, liberty, equality and dignity of the individual, guaranteed by the Constitution or embodied in the international covenants and enforceable by courts in India. A state government may constitute a body known as the Human Rights Commission of that state to exercise the powers conferred upon and to perform the functions assigned to a state commission. The Human Rights Commission is responsible for taking cognizance of the complaints regarding violation of human rights and take appropriate action regarding such violations. Next point, secure environment. Sorry. Secure environment. In the present times, the concept of human rights has become broader, and it is increasingly being accepted that a secure environment is an important human right. At the international level, the awareness and need of saving the environment was expressed in 1970. The experts studying the environment believed that due to industrialization on a large scale and the increasing need for energy has endangered the environment. These activists celebrated the first Earth Day on 22nd April 1970. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides used in agriculture, sound pollution due to vehicles, radiation, sound pollution by the vehicles, radiation from nuclear reactors, oil leakages or leakages of chemical gases make the environment unsafe and create various problems. As a result of this awareness, the question of environmental safety began to be discussed at the international level after the wave of globalization that started in 1990. The interdependence among nations increased, and therefore a need for nations to cooperate with each other emerged. The threat to the environment caused by pollution or by leakage of oil or gas does not remain restricted to one nation. Also, its effects are long term. It becomes necessary for nations to act with each other's consent and cooperation in order to deal with these effects. The visible effects. The visible effects of the degradation of environment are extinction of species of plant and animals, decrease in the fertility of soil, water storage, fluctuation in the proportion of rainfall, global warming, drying up of rivers and lakes, pollution of rivers and seas, incidence of newer diseases, acid rain, thinning of the ozone layer, etc. Even if some of the effects are restricted to particular nations, these problems reach global proportions. Next, Stockholm Conference. In order to discuss the immediate and long-term problems related to the environment and to find solutions on them, a United Nations Conference on Human Environment was called at Stockholm from 5th to 16th June 1972. In this conference, it was stressed that it is the responsibility of all the nations to cooperate to overcome pollution. The developing nations feel that the developed nations are more responsible for the decline of the environment and they should take the responsibility for stopping the decline. Even today, the developing countries take the same position. Another feature of this conference was that the non-governmental organizations working in the field of environmental protection were also present. The issues of the protection of the common global wealth was raised. A consensus emerged that it was the responsibility of all the nations to protect these resources. It was after this conference that the United Nations created the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. Many international treaties about environment were signed after this conference. Several rules were made about the protection of environment. Environmental movements started on a large scale at national as well as at the international level. Non-governmental organizations also assumed a bigger role in the decision-making process at international conferences regarding the environment. The next stage was the environmental conference at Rio in 1992. In this conference, the idea of sustainable development was stressed. Different treaties regarding biodiversity, climate change due to greenhouse gases, protection of forests, etc. were signed. Next point. In 1997, the conference at Kyoto laid down the protocols for the developed countries for preventing climate change. These were applicable for 15 years. After this, the conference on climate change was held at Paris in November 2015. An appeal was made in this conference that all nations should make concerted efforts to stop climate change and global warming, and that the developed countries should help the developing countries to acquire the technology to achieve this goal. Next, terrorism. Terrorism is spreading fear and terror in a society by using or threatening to use violence against common people for achieving political goals. It is organized and planned violence. Terrorist conflict is different from traditional war. Traditional war is a conflict between two or more sovereign states. In such wars, the geographical boundaries between nations acquire importance. On the other hand, terrorist groups can cause violence in any part of the world, from anywhere in the world. The aim of a terrorist attack is to challenge or admit that the regime in a country or refuse to acknowledge existence of the state. It is imperative that the security mechanism of different nations should work in a concerted manner to curb terrorism. Terrorism is a major problem which has intensified in different countries in the last 2 decades. Several countries are facing this problem, and no country is capable of countering it on its own. Terrorism, the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. Terrorism clearly has a very real and direct impact on human rights, with devastating consequences for the enjoyment of the right to life, liberty, and physical integrity of victims. In addition to these individual costs, terrorism can destabilize governments, undermine civil society and security, and threaten social and economic development. All of these also have a real impact on the enjoyment of human rights. Security of the individual is a basic human right, and the protection of individuals is accordingly a fundamental obligation of government. States therefore have an obligation to ensure the human rights of their nationals and others by taking positive measures to protect them against the threat of terrorist act and bringing the perpetrators, means prisoners, arrests of such acts to justice. Come to the next point, the problems of the refugees. Refugee, that means a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution or natural disaster is called refugee. Refugees are the people who have to leave their motherland against their wishes or are forced to go to other nations to seek refuge or for security. The people seek refuge due to torture or persecution for belonging to a particular race or religion, war or natural disaster. In such situations, people are forced to leave their own country and seek shelter in another country. So, examples of refugees. Before the Second World War, the Jews were returned in Germany. Their citizenship and property was confiscated. Due to this, the Jews became refugees in 1971. In 1971, the people in East Pakistan turned refugees and came to India seeking refuge due to political and religious persecution. In the last few years, due to the war-like situation in Iraq and Syria, a lot of people are leaving Syria as refugees. We can cite many such examples of refugees. The refugees face the problems of where to go, will that nation give shelter, and many more. When people of any country are forced to leave their country, their own country as refugees, they have to face many problems. The most important problem is to decide where to go. And will that nation give us shelter? These are the questions that they face. Secondly, they have also to take along with them other members of their family. It involves a lot of physical and emotional stress. Apart from this, there are problems caused by natural elements like heat, rain, storm, as well as shortage of food, sickness, an enemy in pursuit, etc. In this process, many people lose their lives. On arrival in the host country, the refugees face problems of finding work and place to live. Once the refugees reach a safe place, they have new challenges. They need to find work, a place to live, and other problems of a day-to-day nurture. If the language and culture in the other nation are different, then adjusting to that poses difficulties. There is no assurance that the people in the nation which gives shelter to the refugees will accept them. On the contrary, as the number of refugees increase, the strain on the economy of the host nation increases. Means the host country also faces the problems of burden of economy, shortage of essential goods and increase in inflation, essential goods is created, there may be an increase in crime or even inflation. The locals may also lose their jobs. A problem of law and order may crop up. Many such problems may emerge. Due to these problems, many nations are not ready to give shelter to refugees and to resettle them. In 1951, means the efforts to solve problem of refugees. In 1951, some provisions were made regarding the question of refugees at the international level. One such provision was that the refugees will not be forcefully sent back to their country against their wishes. Similarly, an office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations has been established to solve their problems. The problems of the refugees can be solved if all nations safeguarded and fostered human rights. Exploitation and violence would reduce. All people will be able to achieve their own development safely and securely. Human rights can be more effectively implemented if the environment is safeguarded and if terrorism is completely wiped out. No group of people will have to become refugees. For this, all nations have to come together, cooperate with each other, take concrete action and bring about actual change. So students, I hope you understood the lesson. In the next year, we shall study how India has progressed in this direction. Thanks for watching.